We're live.
We're live. Welcome, everybody. Hey, Richard, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. My name is Richard Brennison, Director of Development, NVP App Services. I think that's the title. I don't even actually know what it is anymore. You can find me on Twitter on my little thingy. I'm doing great. Martina, how about you?
Yeah, I'm fine as well. It's a little late for me today, but I'm perfectly fine, and I'm happy to see you again, Richard.
I agree.
I, I am a Microsoft 365 MVP, which makes things a lot easier. Just make it that way. So today we want to introduce you into compliance for Microsoft Teams, and this is one of my favorite topics. And I think we will also have a couple of stories to tell because we spent some time in a room together 2 years ago, or it was 3 years ago, with Richard and discussed compliance all the way around.
It was a week of fantastic discussions, that's for sure.
That's true. And I want to introduce Joanne Klein today, who is our moderator. And I'm so happy to have her in the show because Joanne, for me, is a person I really trust with any question I have around Teams compliance.
Yeah,
Hey,
absolutely.
Joanne.
All the hard questions, Joanne will be able to answer them. We can just take all the
Yes.
easy ones.
Yeah, exactly. So, first of all, I briefly want to introduce the model. It's around compliance, which a couple of people think, okay, this is dry stuff. We only have classification, information governance, and so on. But what we will try is we want to make it fun and interesting, and you can learn along the model together with us. So simply scan the barcode, go into the module, register yourself, and we will see how it works. And stay interactive. We are live. I think we are live on Twitch, on YouTube, and on a lot of other channels. So please stay live with us. Ask us questions, ask us hard questions. We really want to answer them. And we also want to learn what you think about the modules and what interaction, what questions you have, and so on, because we are here for you in the next 90 minutes. So first of all, we start with an introduction. Richard, it's your turn.
Yep. So we're really going to break this down into 4 parts. And as Martina mentioned, right, when you get into compliance, people's eyes kind of roll over, they go in the back, they don't want to think about it. But this is the conversation I have probably more often than like, how do I deploy Teams or a room or something like that? How do I make sure that I know what my data is? How do I ensure that the data is being protected? How to prevent it from being lost, and how do I govern it? So what do those 4 things mean as we move through this to make sure that, as we're putting all sorts of information into Teams, into SharePoint, and all these different places, that we can feel confident for both, the C-level folks that the data is safe, but also the administrators can have easy ways to search it, and the end users can classify it and do all of these things. So it's a really large encompassing thing, but it's these kind of 4 large kind of pillars that we want to do and make sure that we cover. So I think the first one, we're going to jump straight into it, and we're going to talk about sensitivity labels. So what's a sensitivity label, Martina? How do we do this? What is it? What am I looking for?
Yeah, so think about sensitivity labels from the Microsoft Purview information protection. Lets people classify and protect organizational data. And it's everything around the content of the data. So we are making sure that our user productivity and the ability to collaborate isn't hindered. So sensitivity labels, from my perspective, they allow persons to protect and regulate access to sensitive organizational content. Most of us know sensitivity labels from a document, from a Word document, from an email, from an Excel sheet, or anything else. But currently, the really nice things is you can find sensitivity labels within Teams. And that means you can protect your teams, you can classify it, and you also can apply policies to a team classification standard. So that means you can, for instance, provide protection settings that includes encryption and content markings. Or you can protect content in your Office apps which reside within your teams. So if you have a strictly confidential team, for instance, you can have strictly confidential classified content in the team. Also, if you think about that, you can protect content in third-party applications and services by using Defender for cloud applications. And sensitivity labels can also be within Power BI. So we are protecting with sensitivity labels, we are protecting documents, Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites, Power BI sites, and databases. And this is also, think about, you can extend your sensitivity labels, use the same sensitivity labels in a data map. And that means with those protection settings, you're really good to go when you think about labels within teams. Also, when you create a sensitivity label, you are asked to configure the label scope in the Microsoft Purview portal. So that means what kind of labels can I configure for that label, where the label will be visible to the users. Can we apply sensitivity labels to the following scopes: files, emails, Office files, groups, and data assets? And also, if we look at that, we see here, we can just click on all or just one point of that. So for instance, you can use different sensitivity labels for your files and other ones which are just applying to your Microsoft 365 groups or to your Microsoft team. So also consider that.
Martina, I got a quick question on that one.
Yes.
This comes up all the time. People always ask me, should I create different labels? Like my organization, because a lot of older organizations, right? They have a Teams group, they got a file group, they've got a SharePoint group, they got this group, right? So they never talk to each other. Is it best to have different ones across the board, or is it best to like everyone come together and try to have more of a set standard for those sensitivity labels?
So my general recommendation would be to have only that labels that you really need. If you have too many labels, people get confused. Mm-hmm. And it will be also hard to implement and to understand for your users. What I like actually is to have different labels for files and Microsoft Teams. So for instance, you can have a very simple label, and I can also show you that says, okay, I just have a sensitivity labels who clarifies that a specific team is not allowed to have external persons in that. I do not need any strictly confidential or anything else, but I want to let people know this is a team where I'm not allowed to invite guests. So it's kind of a mixed thing, but if you overdo your labels, it gets really complicated from my perspective.
Yeah, agreed 100%. Yeah, agreed 100%, right? Like sometimes I go into organizations and they've got, right, because of the siloed nature, like each group came up with their own set, and sometimes they overlap, right? So one group called it this and the other group called it something slightly different, but it means the same thing.
Yes.
So some coordination is good, but I agree with you, Martina, right? Like also having those unique instances is critical for success.
Yes. Would you also go, so very often when I talk about sensitivity labels, I recommend people to start with traffic lights because it's easy to remember. So green, yellow, red, everyone knows that. Because it's hard to understand for people, what is the difference between public and general, or general and internal, or things like that. So sometimes it's really easy just to start with simple colors, which everyone knows.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. And also think about if you have those kind of distinguishers between labels that they said, okay, strictly confidential is always red, and red means it's a stop sign. There are specific policies on that. And when we go through that, so if we configure that, and as I mentioned before, and you see it here on the demo screen, if you're configuring your labels, you can configure privacy and external user access. So that means the privacy level, if you do it for Microsoft Teams, it's really important that you say, okay, the privacy level of the team is private. It can't be public. It can't be a public team if it's a strictly confidential team. Or you can say, okay, I do not want to have external guests in my team. So it's just, if you go through that kind of configuration, you can make a really safe Microsoft Teams space in your environment. And also, I might show you that in a little demo. So this is Joanne. This is my alter ego. I use her all the time. So I went from Nestor to Joanne, and sometimes I use other nicknames in here. But Joanne, she's the compliance officer of an organization. And what you see here, we have a couple of labels here and also some sub-labels. And what you see here in that configuration, I have a label which is valid for a specific project, which is called Project Obsidian. And you see this label is valid for files, emails, sites, and also Microsoft Teams, which is called Unified Groups in the portal. Don't get confused about that. Unified Groups, Microsoft 365 Groups, Microsoft Teams. So if you see unified groups here, we are talking about Microsoft Teams. And here you see I have two labels which are called Microsoft Ignite for that project. And if I click on that, you will see in the settings, as soon as it loaded, that I have configured it with guests and without guests. So you see here, this is the one with guests where you see, okay, this is the name of the group. And also you see here, this configuration allows external guests. And that means if I have a team set up with that configuration, I can add external guests. And the use case for that could be it's a strictly confidential team, but I have my lawyer and he needs to collaborate with me and he is external. So I need that kind of confidential, strictly confidential team with external guests in it. And you see also I have content marking in here and other settings. So it's quite easy to configure that. How does it look like within Microsoft Teams to show you that? Here in Microsoft Teams, if I create a new team, and you see here, create a new team from scratch, what I can do here is I can look into the classification labeling here. And you see here, it's highly confidential. And I can say, okay, this is a project MS Ignite with guests. And then you see my screen. The only options I have left now is it's a private team. I can't change the configuration to public because I'm in that kind of configuration that only private teams are allowed. So you see, it's really easy to go after those configurations in sensitivity labels.
That's a great example. It's funny because I get asked, how to do that all the time. And then the feature everyone always asks, the follow-up is, can I restrict it so only guests from a certain domain can then join that team? Which is always the funny answer or question that I get asked afterwards. And I mean, not through this mechanism, you can't, obviously, right? Unless there's something super secret that you're aware of that I'm not of.
Not through that mechanism, but you can. There's a way for that, but it's always about trust. And I think if you have an external guest and you want to add them, it's independent of the domain they're working for.
Yep.
It's the person you need to add here. And I trust my users, and I also trust the configuration you're doing here. And also, what you see here is if we go in the device configuration, what we can do here in the configuration is that we say, okay, we want to control external sharing from labeled SharePoint sites because we are labeling a Microsoft team, and behind the Microsoft team, there's a SharePoint site, and the SharePoint site gets the same labels. And that means we can configure here a conditional access policy so that you prevent people from getting access or use any other thing. And also, when users access SharePoint sites from an unmanaged device, so it goes even further, if you want only have access from managed devices, you can configure that as well. And you say, okay, you use that SharePoint feature and that use an Azure Active Directory conditional access policy to block or limit access to SharePoint and OneDrive content from an unmanaged device. So the person who wants access is not able to get access if they use their private iOS or Android device or whatever device they want. Also, there's something which is currently in preview. It's authentication context. This option lets you enforce access conditions when users access SharePoint sites that have the same label applied. The conditions enforce you to select an existing authentication context, and it's published to your conditional access deployment. And that means if the user doesn't meet that conditions, or if they use apps that don't support that kind of authentication, they won't get access to the files. Also think about that. So it's a good combination, combine conditional access policies and also do the data classification on the other side to really have a secure configuration within your Microsoft team. Also, next one is you have to use PowerShell for a couple of that configuration. You will see that in the Learn module. PowerShell is still one of the most important tools you need to know if you work with Microsoft services and Azure. Learn PowerShell, or at least learn how to install certain things and so on. And you also need a couple of PowerShell commandlets to configure information protection as well. Also, a global admin can also is the person who creates and manages the sensitivity labels from the PureView compliance portal. And that also means the global administrator is the one person who is responsible to create that information protection label and also to publish the labels afterwards. So think about that. And publishing labels means you can configure the labels first, and afterwards you are publishing them to specific groups of people in your tenant or to all persons in your tenant. And because we talked about strictly confidential content, think also about scoping the persons who get specific labels. So strictly confidential, for instance, for project MS Ignite with guests, it's only available to Richard, Joanne, and me. So it could be that way as well.
It's a great way to test. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was gonna say it's a great way to test too, right?
Yes.
So when you're figuring it out, if you've never touched it before, sometimes people get really afraid to just throw it out there. So I use scoping all the time as that first baby step, so that people can kind of see it and play with it.
Yes. And also one of the main tips, and I think I will repeat that a couple of times during today's session, is always consider, if you use the Microsoft PureView compliance portal, that it needs time to publish things here. So that means if you turn labels on, don't expect them to be available after 5 minutes. It could take a couple of hours, or maybe a couple of more hours. So also, in our example, and I showed that already in the demo. This screenshot here, you see when you have done that and you use that confidential label, you will see it's available here. You can only publish it for private teams. And as you have seen in the demo, this is really a good approach if you want to have that kind of security also applied on your team's environment.
Yeah.
That being said,
I have
it's
one
not
other
only labeling.
Right. Yeah. I have one question before we run away from that I get asked all the
Yes.
time. Do I need to have like an Azure P1, P2 to be able to use these features, or do I not need special licensing to get to things like sensitivity labels?
Yes. It's the basic information protection and data classification comes with E3.
Yep.
But, and there's always a but when we talk about licensing, the advanced functionality and advanced functions like recommendations and so on is always an advanced licensing. It could be E5 compliance, or it could be the full E5 package.
Yeah, I always tell people Microsoft does have a fantastic page where they document all the different licenses and what goes with what. We could spend 75 minutes going through feature by feature and talk about where they fall in a license thing. So I just always kind of direct people there as much as I can, because the
It's
answers
true.
are there typically.
Yes, and it's so easy, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. So, all right, so we're going to talk about managing retention policies next. That is what we'll dive into. So we talked about how we're going to kind of label our information. Now we want to retain it. How do we retain that information in our organization? So if you want to run to my slides. There we go. Fantastic. All right. So retention policies are really neat because they can be applied across a litany of different areas, right? So in this screenshot here alone, you can see, right, I can be very granular. I can set my retention policies all the way from Microsoft Exchange through Teams, through Yammer, right, and the whole area. So I could create a single policy that does all these things, or I could go ahead and separate them out into several different policies, which is typically what I see much more often than some sort of like super uber global policy that does everything from that perspective. But definitely have the flexibility to go ahead and kind of pick and choose what you're looking for. When you're in the retention policies, you kind of have this idea of both retention and deletion, right? And we'll talk a little bit more later on about what happens when those items come into conflict with one another, because I could have a policy on one team or globally that has a retention, and maybe on a team I might have like a delete policy on a different one. So what happens when those kind of intersect with one another, and how do we deal with that kind of intersection? So it's just important to remember, right? Retention is like we're retaining it. Deletion is like it's gone. And once it's out of the retention period, you're not getting it back, kind of thought process. So you got to be kind of careful what you're doing here. And this is one of those areas where we talked about scoping. And on the previous slides, you could see that, right? We can scope with included and excluded teams. Always, always, always test this one before you just kind of mass blanket your entire chat environment or something like that. You'd be surprised the number of times I've had that phone call where someone turned something on as a test, and then 30 days later, they were wondering why everyone's chats were gone. Have you had that one happen yet? Like, all of my chats are gone. What happened? It was kind of a scary moment for them.
Yeah, this is also this is one of the most popular questions I get. So it's if you think about data privacy and discuss that a lot with customers, very often they said, okay, can I chat is kind of the private thing within Teams, and everything which is business-wise happens in a Teams conversation. So can I delete or let it automatically be deleted in the chat, in the Teams chat? I see that a lot, and I got a lot of questions around that.
Yeah, number one. Like I get it asked. I had a customer that a C-level individual didn't realize that this was possible, so they went every Monday morning and would individually delete messages out of their one-on-one chats and kind of built their own retention policy, um, which just kind of blew my mind of how much time they spent on a weekly basis just hitting the delete key over and over again. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, I just, if there's a will, there's a way, right? Like at some point in time. So here's the idea of what happens when things conflict. And I kind of like this visual because it kind of helps understand the principles, right, of what happens. So generally, right, retention will always win over deletion. So if I've got a policy that's assigning to both, we're going to take the two and retention would win over that deletion policy. The longest retention period then is the one that wins as well. So if I had two retention policies potentially, one was 180 days and one was 60 days, the 180 would win. The caveat to that is if I've got an explicit delete. So maybe I've got a retention policy on the entire organization, but I have an explicit delete maybe on a particular team, then that explicit will win in that case because it has a higher priority than when we have the retention because that was kind of set at a higher level. And then again, if we've got them in conflict, the shortest deletion period always wins. So it's an interesting slide to kind of think about how it breaks down. It reminds me of like the old like group policy objects, the GPO days of long ago. Like I had 5 GPOs. How do they all interact with one another? But kind of keeping that in mind, right? How it flows from retention to delete to the periods kind of helps understand what's going to happen in the grand scheme of things.
So, quick question here. If you
Yeah.
have two persons, so consider it's Martina and Richard,
Yep.
and the deletion policy for Richard is 1 day, and the deletion policy for Martina is 10 days. What happens if they chat?
In that case, it should be the shortest should win. The 1 day should win in that instance, right? So, kind of understanding that I think is kind of critical. And I don't think try to remember there isn't a way for the end user that we don't see that in the UI still. So it's kind of one of those things you just have to be aware of that it exists.
Yeah, so it might produce a lot of support cases
Yeah.
or confused users
Yeah.
if you're doing it the right way. Yeah.
Right. And if you're too aggressive with it, right? So I think it's a really important conversation of, right? Like I've had organizations that have wanted to go as short as like 14 days or 10 days for chat retention. And you'd be shocked by the amount of um, what I like to refer to as the shadow IT solution of just hitting print, right? Like the number of times I've walked into an office and they had piles of chat messages that they physically printed because they knew it was going to delete on such an aggressive schedule. So there are gives and takes when you kind of make some of these decisions at a high level.
Yeah. So think about it that way. There is a way for the user to stay productive.
Hmm.
And it's kind of it's shadow IT through the printer in that case.
Yeah.
I see the same scenario with using downloading everything to a USB drive, for
Yep.
instance, because they know, okay, there's a deletion policy, but I want to keep the data, so I have to make a backup of it.
Right. Yeah. There's that game that I think, and there's such a disconnect sometimes between IT decisions, security decisions, and the end user, right?
Mm.
And this is one of those ones where I think it's really important for the three to really think long and hard because it shouldn't be a barrier, but you can
Mm.
easily make it a barrier if you're not careful. So it's just one of the things I always talk about when we're working with
Yeah.
customers.
And would you recommend to use retention and deletion policies
I,
all
I
along?
I mean, My default, unless there is a strong legal reason, the answer typically is no, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where I have pushed, right? There are clearly instances where you might have a legal requirement, right,
Mm-hmm.
to delete things after a certain time.
Mm-hmm.
But unless it's really compelling, I think it creates more problems than it solves by having an aggressive delete or retention policy. So that's from my perspective. How about you, Martina?
So it kind of depends. So if, as you already said, if the customer has a legal requirement to keep data, so for instance, text data need to be kept for 7 years,
Hmm.
there's nothing against a retention policy. An aggressive deletion policy very often creates kind of shadow IT user behavior, which was probably not the intention in the first run, that user
Right.
said, okay, I do not want my messages deleted after 2 days. I
Yep.
want to keep them. And also one of the other recommendations I would give users is, or administrators who create retention and deletion policies, it's always, what are you doing currently in email? Do we have already a retention policy in place? How does it work? And then keep the same policy and don't be harder within Teams than you are in Exchange. So that means if the users have the opportunity to keep all their emails forever, why deleting their chats? So this is also something. Try to make it a service which the user can understand why you are deleting or keeping messages.
Yeah, for sure. And the other piece I always tell individuals when they're making this decision, right? Obviously, there's that legal aspect that plays into it. If you end up in a world where you have that shadow IT, right? I was helping a government organization where they deleted emails every 30 days, right? So people were constantly hitting the print button to emails, right? What is your responsibility from a discovery standpoint, right? Like we're going to talk about eDiscovery later and being able to do
Mhm.
that, but if I've created this environment where we have people printing stuff, am I now liable, right, from a legal perspective to try to hunt down all these paper copies of stuff too? So you, through these policies, you might build some of the most wild burdens on your IT staff that you never thought about. So just things to kind of think about. When you're creating a retention policy, it's really, really easy. And that's what I like about how the Purview environment is happening right now, right? So it's literally you click the create button inside of data lifecycle management, and you're going to pick that screen we saw before. You're going to give it a name, and then you're just going to walk through the wizard and say, these are the things I want to retain. Here's how long I want to keep them or delete them or whatever the case is. So the actual process for creating it is super simple. I think the decision making up to it is probably the trickiest part, honestly.
Yeah, it's true. And also think about it, very often I see short retention or short retention policies um, is something which is in place because of historical reasons, where people have to save space on their mailboxes
Yeah,
and keep it very small. So this is no longer the case. You have so much space in your Exchange Online mailbox. So that means you do not need to delete everything. You can also use your Exchange Online archive for other things. And you also have a lot of space within the SharePoint portals. On
agreed.
the other side, keep everything is probably also not the best decision. So if you find documents which are 30 years old or 20 years old, which you can't open any longer, it might be backfiring in the opposite direction.
Yep, agreed. All right, so I think that's everything for retention. So we're going to talk a little bit about data loss prevention policies, or oftentimes referred to as DLP. So
Yes.
Martina, do you want to take it over?
Yeah, take it over. So data loss prevention policies is also something which is quite interesting because an organization has to protect sensitive information and they need to protect it from inadvertent disclosure. So that means if you have a regulation in place and you need to have a protection change from time to time, you need to have a data loss prevention policy in place. So for instance, like it is for us, we have sensitive information in unstructured data within Microsoft 365. It could be a social security number, it could be a credit card number, or anything else. And you do not classify it, but you need to make sure that those kind of data is not shared with an anonymous sharing link or with an email or anything else. And this means a data loss prevention policy, a DLP policy, can help you to identify that kind of sensitive information across your Microsoft 365 universe. That means you can discover sensitive information in mailboxes, on SharePoint, in OneDrives, and also within Microsoft Teams. And also, a data loss prevention policy is reviewing the content all the time. That means if you create a document and the next version of the document contains 100 credit card numbers, the data loss prevention policy will see that and protect you from oversharing that kind of information. Also, if you go into a policy definition for data loss prevention, and you see it here in the example, we have a social security number here, classified information, and so on. You can specify what am I doing with that DLP policy. So for instance, you can say, okay, I will report it to an administrator. I will override it. Guest access is not allowed, or anything else. And that means if someone attempts to share sensitive information in a Teams chat or in a channel with guests, with a DLP policy, you can prevent this situation, because the DLP policy looks into the information and deletes the chat, for instance, or if that kind of deletion happens automatically and within seconds, you can make sure that that kind of data is not shared to persons who do not need to have that access. Also, think about if you have a social security number in a Microsoft Teams channel and that message gets blocked due to the data loss prevention policy. And that means you get an information, what can I do because I need access to that file, and then you will get an information and the user will understand why that information is not visible for them. So you see with the data loss prevention policy, and I see it always as a double side. You have data classification on one side, but then you have data loss prevention for the content which is not classified but still needs protection. And you see here the social security number was blocked and the user gets an information what to do and why they can do that. Also, from the configuration, look at an overview about what configuration you can do. So for instance, Exchange email, you can include or exclude distribution groups. You can choose what you want to monitor. So you can have a predefined policy template that helps you get started, or you can create a custom policy. So for instance, you can look at predefined policy templates. That means financial data, medical health data, privacy data. I live in Europe. We talk about GDPR all the time. And all those security or data privacy information comes, you have a Californian Privacy Act and so on. So people care about data privacy. And with the DLP policy templates, you can simply configure that out of the box. Or If you like to do regex expressions and do it all by yourself, you can define your own data loss prevention policies. So that means you can configure that, put in your regex. Then you can say, okay, what location I need to include or exclude. Should it cover Exchange email or distribution groups or SharePoint sites or whatever you want. And also what you see here, we have Teams chat included and channel messages, but you can also look at your Windows 10 or Windows 11 devices or at specific groups and apps in here. And also you can extend the data loss prevention policy to on-premises repositories. And that means if you have data stored on a local network share or wherever you want, the data loss prevention policy can look after this data as well. So, Richard, quick question. Are you using data loss prevention policies a lot?
Yeah, we do. So we always start. I love the Social Security and credit card examples because they resonate and they're so easy to set up. It's one of the first things we always do with organizations, just so they can kind of see it in action and also alert on it, right? And that's the beauty of Purview and all these things, that when it happens, it's not like it just happens and no one knows about it, right? Like there are great logs and information so that as an IT admin, you can kind of see the issue, right? Like the number of times I've been in organizations like, oh no, my end users, they never send credit card information via an email. That never happens, right? Then we turn it on and within, hours, we get that first alert, right? That someone did it.
Yeah.
I think is always eye-opening, right? For everyone involved. So yeah,
Yeah.
we're a big fan of it. We typically do the out of the box stuff. I haven't run into too many instances where I'm building my own regex. I haven't had that scenario so much, but I know it's there. I just haven't used it personally too
Yeah.
deeply.
But think about, and what I also really like about that, from the predefined policies, you can learn so much how much data you have in your tenant, because you do not know what kind of emails or chat messages people are sending over. And that means you really get a lot of information out there.
Right. And you don't have to block it necessarily right away
Yeah.
either, right? Like you can just use it to report first to help change user behavior. But obviously, you can also, like we saw in the Social Security example, just straight up block the information to prevent it from ever getting outside. So,
Yeah, that's true. And also think about data loss prevention policies can be applied to specific locations in your tenant, as you see here on the screen. So you can configure it only for Exchange, or you can configure it only for Yammer or your Teams applications or anything else. So you can also scope the content, and you can also reduce it to specific users and sites if we think about SharePoint and what we can do here. So, and that brings us to another topic, which is kind of connected to data loss prevention.
yeah,
And this is
absolutely.
communication compliance.
Yeah. So, um, go ahead and take a look at the slides I have here on communication compliance. And I think what Martina explains is pretty accurate, right? They are very similar type of items. And I try to think of, and I've never had, like, some people always ask, like, what's the exact differences between them? And there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of overlap between the two, but there's also definitely kind of that larger piece. So I always try to describe it as kind of a more holistic approach of how people are communicating inside of the organization so that you can kind of, have an entire process behind it. It helps you to both detect it, investigate it, how to remediate it, right? Inside the organization. It's not built like you could make it a negative, right? And that, I think that's probably the biggest thing I didn't mention before. If you go into it with the mindset that we're building this as a negative, that we're going to go punish our employees for doing this stuff, you're going to have a really, really poor reception to deploying this type of stuff, right? That it has to be aimed at such a way that helps guide constructively the organization. That's kind of how I've always tried to aim it at. I think that's kind of an important thing. This one does kind of get beyond that aiming. So a lot of times you can think of data communication compliance as, right, if people are being offensive or harassing language, right, between employees, or sending, explicit images, stuff like that, things that wouldn't necessarily get caught in a DLP policy, but would be caught more within this communication compliance policy. That's what you're looking for here in those kind of instances. So that's the best way I try to kind of describe the differences between DLP and communication compliance. Do you take another angle, Martina, or is that pretty close to you as well?
Yeah, it's pretty close to what I think about communication compliance, and also what I try to explain all the time is, think about if you have a code of conduct in your organization and you want to make sure that everything works the way you have defined it as an organization. Communication compliance is really a very helpful tool to use and to implement here.
Right. Yeah. And the other piece, I think that's another thing that I like to kind of DLP. It's not. I mean, I often say it's like binary. It's true or false, right? If I look at a number, it's Social Security or not, right? There's some instances where that doesn't make sense. Whereas this is much more AI driven, where we're going to kind of look at a little bit more of a holistic, right? Like patterns and stuff like that will help kind of react and show that information. So um, when we talk about it, right, it is this kind of workflow, right? We configure items, we investigate the items, and then we remediate them. And the key piece there in between all that then is this monitor concept, right? That we're going to monitor the entire environment for these items that we've set up, right? Harassing language, right? Explicit images, those kind of things. So that we're doing that continuous monitoring inside the environment. Um, so a lot of words on this screen. I won't read them all for you, but the idea, right, and these are some of the big items we talk about, right? That inappropriate text, the images, right? It's another way to monitor for sensitive information and regulatory compliance, right? We talked about GDPR and stuff like that. Like all of this fits into that larger scheme. And these are all kind of the things that you can do and configure within this communication compliance. Once we've configured it, then we get into that investigation part, right? Where I can set up alerts, I can have it email me or do other things like that. I can create issues, I can document and review them, right? I can create filters. So it's more than just like, here's something and good luck, figure it out. They do try to walk you through the process, right, in that flow as much as possible, keeping in mind, right, that you might have other systems on top of this, like HRs and stuff like that, that might interact inside of this. And then the last one is that remediate, right? So we can do things, right? Like here you can see in the example, we can remove items, right? So if items we've alerted on them, we've investigated them, yep, they're really bad, right? I can go through the process and go ahead and like disconnect or remove those items out of teams after we've done that kind of remediation and kind of process. And these are just some examples, right? So, right, you can do simple things like policy tips, right? We're all familiar with policy tips from Outlook, right? I try to send an email to 10,000 people. It's going to tell me that's a really bad idea. We can kind of do some of that same stuff here. So we create the different policy tips and notifications and kind of all those kind of fun environments. And the last one is you just continue to monitor, right? You've got great widgets and dashboards and whatnot. This I've always found seems to be one of the things that if there's like an order, and I don't think there's necessarily an order, but like an order where people deploy things inside of Purview, this always to me it's towards the end for some reason. And I don't know if that's like the right or wrong answer. It's just I've noticed as organizations go through this compliance journey that this seems to be one of the last things they do in their environment. Um, that's been my experience with it, at least.
Mm.
Same for you,
And
Martina, or?
Yeah, and also when I think about use cases, and Joanne also brought a great use case up here in the chat. But what I also recommend customers is use or go into your use cases. So like you see here, communication compliant, you can use that for regulatory compliance. To detect insider trading, for instance. And this is really a hot topic. If you're working in FSI, you need to be compliant within your organization. And for those kind of information, you also can use communication compliance policies. And on the other side, a great example for me is still code of conduct. And one of the things, or one of the pro tips I always give my customers is include a compliance officer, because very often I see that IT operations is responsible for communication compliance. And those are probably not the persons who should handle that kind of sensitive information. It could be HR, it could be a compliance officer, it could be a legal department, but probably not the global administrator, who actually has no access to that policies.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to what we talked about before, right? Trying to break down some of those silos that exist in a lot of organizations today, because you've got that legacy IT mindset in some cases. This is another great place where you kind of have to come together to be successful in it.
Yeah, it's true. But speaking about silos, I think we can speak about information barriers. So if we are going in there, and if you look at what you need to do, if you talk about information barriers and what's an information barrier, first of all, you need to enable a scope directory search. And the scope directory search, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of a legacy configuration which comes out of Exchange. Because you see here with enabled scope directory search, Microsoft Teams use the same functionality, and it allows organizations to create virtual boundaries within Microsoft Teams that control how users find and communicate with other users in their organization. And also, Microsoft Teams let organizations provide custom views of the directory to their users. So it could be, if you have information barriers in place, it could be one of the policy could be that you say, I do not want my sales department to talk with the retail department for whatever reason, or I do not want a specific person to talk to others in the same environment. And scope directory search is one of the first things you have to configure. And just to show you where that is, I'm heading back to my live demo, and I'm still Joanne. And Joanne is a compliance officer, but she is also a Teams administrator. And to enable that kind of settings, you see here from the Teams dashboard, first of all, you have to go into Teams settings. And here within Teams settings, you have scope directory search, and this need to be enabled by default. And this is the first setting you have to do before you start configuring your information barrier policies. And then, as I mentioned before, and as I will mention in the future, take your time, drink a coffee or a tea, and wait for at least 12 to 24 hours before you start configuring your information barrier policies. So that means if we look at that, what is an information barrier policy? So those kind of policies, they prevent lookups and discovery within Microsoft Teams. And this is also something which is really important. So it's a Microsoft Teams setting. It works in SharePoint as well. but it's not an overall setting for the whole tenant. So it could happen that people see each other outside of Microsoft Teams or can communicate there with other tools. But if you think about when you want to prevent a team to communicate with another team or sharing data with another team, so it's kind of an opposite configuration to a shared channel, more or less. So in that case, you are preventing specific teams from communicate to each other. So to bring you an example is Alex. Alex V is working in the banking segment, and Bill belongs to the financial advisor segment. They can't communicate with each other because the information barrier policy blocks the communication between those two segments. It could be insider trade which is involved here, and you do not want them to communicate. But also on the other side, both persons, Alex and Bill, they can communicate with Lee in HR. Also, what you see here in the example, if you have an information barrier policy in place, you can't look up specific persons anymore within Teams. So if Bill wants to chat with Alex, he won't find him in the directory. Or if they had a chat, they will not be able to chat with each other after the information barrier policy is in place. Also, think about if you add members to a team. Whenever you add a member to a team, the user policy will be re-evaluated and the information barrier policy will be applied to the team member. And that means if the policy blocks them to be added to the team, you won't be allowed to do so. Also, chats, or if you invite the user to a meeting. So for instance, Bill is unable to attend a meeting from Alex. So it could be that way as well. Configuration of information barrier policies, I still like the PowerShell approach because it's kind of, I have a worksheet which is in Excel, and from that I'm defining my policies, and then I do the configuration through PowerShell, then I wait a little bit, give it some time, and then the information barrier policy is in here. Also think about the prerequisites are really important in that case. Scope directory search is the first one you have to enable, and then follow those steps which are here in the table, which I won't read through. Also, if you go with the PowerShell configuration, you will see here, you can use Azure Resource Manager PowerShell, and then you can add the information barrier policy in here. From a licensing perspective, for information barrier policies, you need E5 licenses for Microsoft 365 or Office 365, or the compliance bundles or insider risk management policies. And from a permission perspective, who can create and configure information barrier policies? It needs to be either a global administrator or a compliance administrator who is able to configure that. Also think about audit logging must be enabled upfront, and you need to have the PowerShell commandlet for security and compliance module, and also for Azure Active Directory to have information barriers applied in your environment. Just to give you a quick look at how that works, because Joanne is a compliance administrator as well. Here on the left in the Microsoft Purview portal, there's also the option to configure information barriers here. So that means, first of all, you're configuring your segments, which means I want to prevent the financial department to speak to the marketing department. And then after you have defined your segment, you go into policies, create your new policies, and so on. And then you turn the policy on. what you see here, because I haven't added any scoped search and any departments, I still get an error because that configuration is still empty in that demo environment. And this is also one of the reasons I still like the configuration through PowerShell. The user segmentation, as you have seen here, is it's just the segments need to have only one information barrier. So that means Richard can't be in the marketing segment and in the sales segment. You need to segment the user that he's only in one segment. Also, think about if you segment your users and you go there, think about certain directory attributes that you see. It's the department, it's the location, or anything else, to use kind of group filters in here. And the other part is when you have defined your information barrier policies, and after you have segmented the users, you go and say, okay, I want to have a block policy, or I want to have an allow policy between different segments here in my information barrier policy. And after you have done that, and after some time, you see here, you are applying the information barrier policy to your tenant, and that means you set it to an active state, and that means after it's provisioned throughout the environment, you will have an active information barrier policy in place. Still, to give you one of my tips is allow it to have some time and think about if you're configuring information barrier policies, do you need them? What kind of use case you have for your information barrier policies? Do you really want to prevent users from talk to each other and so on? Or are there other possibilities how you can separate users from each other in a communication flow?
Yeah, for sure. I think information barriers is one of the most complex things that's inside of this, right? Inside of purview and compliance and security. I found some really weird cases where people have tried to implement it and it usually fails. And the number one thing that people have come to me, and I've never quite understood this, goes back to your comment you made before, to trust the users, right? We run into organizations where a group of individuals, typically C-level folks, say they don't want people to be able to message them directly, right? So they go through this whole process to try to segment the CEO and the CFO and these folks into a little group, and they use information barriers, and it typically falls apart really quick because, like, when you have an information barrier set up, it's not just I can't like chat with them, I can't call them, I can't participate in meetings with, like, there's a lot of things that happen under the hood. So like Martina mentioned it, if there's a better way to do it from a user behavior, don't rely on this technology solution for those kind of instances. Like, I think it's got to be a really solid, I typically say, what's the legal reason why they can't talk to each other? If it's a legal reason, let's do it, right? If it's I don't want to be bothered by the so-and-so, whole different conversation, right? So that's been my experience. Do you see
Talk about user adoption in that case?
Right, exactly, 100%. I mean, that's been, oddly enough, I see people, right? There's the real, like, I've got a fiscal response, like it's a financial information services, right? Like, those make sense. I've seen it used in, someone was doing an acquisition and they used it during the acquisition phase because they had migrated the customer already in because they knew the acquisition was going to get approved, but they were waiting for approval. So they like did it in that instance, and that made a ton of sense. But beyond that, like using it to just like break the communication flow with people, yeah, that's a lot of help desk tickets coming your way. That's my experience. How about you?
Yeah, it's kind of the same, and it needs a lot of talk with use cases with the business, before you start implementing information barrier policies. Yes,
Yeah.
there are use cases, but probably not the obvious ones.
Yep, for
In
sure. And
first
it's
place.
also one of those, right? Like on that last slide Martina had, right? Like there's basically an on switch. So you're turning it on. So it's not one of those things that's like super easy to like test, right?
Yes,
Like, and because as mentioned before, this one is not immediate. This is turn it on, grab your coffee for 24 hours and come back and hope it's all working. So like undoing it is a pretty lengthy undo moment as well. So
it's true.
yeah, I try to steer people away from it unless they've got a really great explanation why they need to do it.
It's true.
And there are some, obviously.
Yeah.
All right, so next we're going to jump back to my slides and we're going to talk a little bit about eDiscovery at this point in time. And what does eDiscovery mean? How does it work, right? Why is it important? Those type of things. So at the most basic level, right, eDiscovery is that process where we're going to identify information that's electronically stored for um, legal cases. Typically, there are other instances you might use eDiscovery, right, for HR and those kind of things, but typically it's a legal tool, and that we're using this eDiscovery tool then to search through Teams content. And it says Teams content here, but it's everything in Office 365, right? So it's your email, it's all the other things that are in there. And there is a note here at the bottom, and it's a great call out on this page, right? Because people think about eDiscovery and legal hold. A lot of times they go hand in hand, and they wonder why I've put, Alice on legal hold. Why isn't all of Alice's communications in their team also on legal hold? They're separate settings. So you've got to make sure that wherever Alice is in that case, right, you're ensuring that you've got that legal hold on all the places that Alice might be communicating, if that's an important aspect. So it's a really good call out here. So here's those kind of different conversations, right? This is kind of that Teams environment. So you got your one-on-one chats, your standards, your private chats, standard channels, private channels. It's not on here, but shared channels would also have a role inside of your eDiscovery as well. And obviously your user's OneDrive environment all kind of gets combined in that realm of eDiscovery. So the concept is really easy. It's keyword search typically, and then you scope, right? So I want to know how often people are talking about where to go for lunch. So I could create a eDiscovery with the term lunch in it if I wanted to. I could scan across all of my team's environments and I could find out, for example, that maybe, everyone spends an hour and a half each day trying to figure out where they're going to go to lunch, for example. That's a terrible thing to do to your end users, but that is an example. You could do that type of discovery inside of using eDiscovery in this case. So, and then there are two different types of eDiscovery. We have this core or standard, and then we have advanced or premium, right? And as you can imagine, premium comes with fancier features, lots more options, but obviously comes at a licensing expense. So you need to make sure that you have the proper licensing to be able to do that information. Permissions. This one's important. eDiscovery is you need to give someone permission to do eDiscovery. The global admin can't just roll in and start doing eDiscovery across your environment. You explicitly have to give them permission to be able to do this. Yes, the global admin could give themselves compliance permission, right? Like that is an option, but you have to explicitly say, hey, these individuals have permission to do eDiscovery. So it's not one of those things. A lot of times I get asked that question all the time. I'm trying to do eDiscovery. I don't have permissions. Why? Well, you probably didn't give yourself permissions, right? So it's one of the few, and there are some other instances where the global admin doesn't magically have all of the permissions inside the tenant. So That'd be a great, I wonder if Microsoft has that article. These are all the things that you can't do as a global admin. I probably do. I just don't think I've ever seen it now that I think about it. I might have to try to find it. So creating an eDiscovery case, right? It is really easy. It is literally, you go into the UI, you pick a case, you save the name, and then you go ahead and you start entering the kind of the filters that you want. So in this case, right, I could choose my locations that I wanted to search for. So in this example, we're searching mailboxes, SharePoint, and Exchange public folders. And what's critical here is when you see things that say Exchange mailboxes, underneath it, you'll see that it says Office 365 groups, Teams, and Yammer, right? Because that discovery information for those items are actually stored in Exchange. So that's why we're searching those Exchange mailboxes. And the same thing with SharePoint, right? When you say SharePoint sites, SharePoint is really big. It does a lot of things now. So it's OneDrive and group sites and team sites and Yammer and all those things. So picking the locations, you get really large, but then you can scope it down and you can exclude it as well, which is also critical. And then when you're setting up your query, you're typically just querying for words or conditions and stuff like that. So, you know, the example says to give it a meaningful name and description, yes, but for the most part, it's just throw in what you're looking for. And when you're done, you can export out the information and then you can hand it off to someone else. Because in most cases, right, with eDiscovery, you're not the person who's consuming this, right? You're doing this work for someone as a compliance officer, and if it's a legal thing, you might be handing off to the lawyers or whoever the case is. So oftentimes it's kind of an export, and you walk away and kind of wash your hands of it. So that's kind of the rundown of eDiscovery. I think about where eDiscovery has come in the last 15 years, right? Like having mailbox holds and all this other stuff to where we are now. It's kind of amazing how much has changed, right? And even 2, 3, 4 years, right? Time in Office 365, how much easier this continues to get, because it used to be an absolute bear to be able to do this type of stuff, like days of work, which is now super short. Anything else you can think of, Martina, around eDiscovery that I
So
left out?
for me, eDiscovery, it's so useful because it saves you actually money. If you create a search case and then you get only the data you want.
Mm-hmm.
And also what I love here is the export feature, because you get content exported within an Excel file, and then you can use all the Excel magic in that file and identify the content very easily and very fast.
Yeah.
Also, if you're handing over data, you can create secure keys and you can say, okay, this is a secure download link, which only applies to whoever person needs access to that cases.
Yeah, I forgot to. I was gonna. I even wrote that down to mention that because I get asked that too all the time. Like, where am I putting this after I export it? Right? If I just throw it into a public folder or something. No, you get to secure it down. It's nice and secure. You don't have to worry about any of that. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of kind of the workflow and the entire process that we have now inside of um, eDiscovery. So the other piece that's kind of that goes with eDiscovery, right, to a degree, is when we talk about compliance recordings, right? Now we've got all this Teams information, we have our chats and our, documents and everything else, but what about the actual conversations that are happening in meetings, on one-on-one calls, right? All these kind of group calls. How do we manage and store and maintain that information? So inside of Teams, you have the ability to create and manage compliance recording policies. And these are very different than simply saying we're going to record all of our meetings, right? So as a Teams admin, I can go in and I can turn on by default now that we're going to record meetings by default. It just turns on, right? We have all that. But in all of those cases, the end user has the ability to disable that, right? I could turn it off. I don't want to have this call recorded for whatever reason. In this instance, we're talking about a compliance recording policy where the end user has no ability to disable the recording process, right? Like there are options, but generally speaking, they can't just willy-nilly turn it on and off. So how it works is that when user A goes and makes a telephone call to user B, we're going to do a policy check, and we're going to see if there is a policy placed on the users that this call needs to be recorded. If the answer is yes, leveraging a third-party provider, we're then going to auto-invite in a recording bot. So essentially, every call, even though it's a peer-to-peer call, this extra bot kind of gets thrown into the side of the conversation. And what that bot is there for then is to basically listen in and stream the audio of the call back into that partner solution so that we can record it, we can archive it, right, and do all the kind of the fun things that we'd want to do with that compliance recording. And this is super common in contact centers, and other type of help desk environments, right, where you're always recording these phone calls. And every partner solution has different options, right? One of the questions that get asked all the time, like, can I turn it off if someone's going to say something sensitive, right? Depending on the solution, right, the answer is yes. So it's important to kind of look at what the third-party provider provides for it, but know that compliance recording requires that partner solution. You kind of need to go out and have someone, or I guess if you're really good at development, Microsoft does have all the tools out there. You could build your own bot and put it in there, but I would tell you to go ahead and find that partner solution. It'll probably save you some effort in the grand scheme of things. And configuring it, right, it's just done via PowerShell. This information is provided to you by your provider, right, that you're going to go in and have the different app IDs, and you're going to build this, and then you're going to set up the policies for your end users. So compliance recording has gotten a lot easier, right, as time has gone on, because the third-party offerings have gotten much more robust through the process. So if you're looking at them, Microsoft on their website has a great list of everyone who's supported inside of this space for compliance recording. Did I miss anything?
No, and I actually like compliance recording in the use cases you already mentioned.
Yeah, so it's super common. It's just kind of one of those things that some organizations need, but not every organization needs. I think that's the key piece there. All right, so next we're going to talk about security and compliance alerts. So now we want to alert on stuff. So Martina, I think you're going to share with us how we're going to set up some alerts and what we're going to do and all those kind of fun things.
Yeah, it's true. So before monitoring and alerting is kind of an important scenario. So you can use alerts to monitor user activities within Microsoft Teams. They are generated when a user performs certain activities that match the conditions of your alert policy. For example, a malware attack, a phishing campaign, unusual level of file deletions, external sharing. You can create and review the alert dashboards in the Microsoft Purview portal. And you see here in the example, those kinds of alerts are very useful if you categorize them. You can also say, okay, the policy which is applied goes into the category threat management, or it's an information governance policy, and so on. And that helps you to investigate certain alerts from specific people in your tenant. And in that diagram, you see how the basic workflows of an alert policy works. So first of all, you create the policy, then you perform actions, and then the alert is generated, and the action alert is triggered, and it sends an email if you still want to get emails for every single alert you get. Or you can have an alert entry in the alert dashboard in your compliance center, which is the thing I prefer because I get way too many emails. And the administrator can review the alert in the alert dashboard and decide if he needs to dismiss the alert or if he acknowledges the alert. From the policy, you see here also you can go into how often the alert is triggered each time, or you have it when equal things happen, that you have it every 15 minutes or anything else. And also from a triggering perspective, you can create the alert policy and can say, okay, I want a new alert policy, which is in a specific topic. What is the activity around that? What is the severity around that, and so on. And to give you a practical example, I use that kind of alert if you work a lot with auditors and they said, I need an audit role in my tenant which does yada, yada, yada. And then you can work with an alert policy and give the auditor that kind of information he's looking for without doing any other investigation in the tenant. Also, alert policies are based on ABAC permissions, so role-based access control permissions, and that means you can assign user-specific alerts in your portal. For instance, records management or information governance or threat management category, you have specific people in your organization who look at those kind of alerts. That being said, we have a knowledge check in place, and we have a couple of questions before we wrap up for today.
All right, so let's jump to question number 1. I think you've got the control still. Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
All right. So you can click the link below to be able to vote at aka.ms/polls. So our first question is that as a administrator, right, creating a sensitivity label when defining the scope, Holly configures the setting. What else can Holly define as part of that scope? Options would be where the label will be visible, a help link to a custom page, or choose which users and groups see the label. So you can go ahead and vote which one you believe is the right answer for that. And while people are taking a look at that, the only thing I would say on the last section about alerts, and I'm with you, Martina, I don't want emails. They're way too many. The person who's getting this does need to have a honest conversation with themselves. If they're not going to send the emails, they need to go look at the actual dashboard, right? Like the number of times I've run into an organization where like, well, I didn't know it was there. And we're like, well, you remember that conversation where you said you didn't want the emails and you promised to go look at the dashboard? You need to go look at the dashboard. So there's that kind of like honest moment where people are actually going to receive their alerts and all that kind of fun stuff. So, all right, gave it a moment. We had some votes. So the answer is A. That is where the labels will be visible to the user. So as that enterprise admin, Holly, when they're creating the label, they get to choose, right, visibility levels. And that visibility, for example, right, as Martina showed, shows up right in the team's client, right in the team, up in that top corner, right, confidential or whatever the case might be.
So
yeah.
Another question would be question number 5.
Question number 5. All right. Oh, where did you go? Oh, it's back. Okay. All right. So which of the following 365 role groups can't view any alerts because none of the assigned roles provide permission to view alerts from any alert category? That uses the word alert a lot. So is that the Microsoft Purview records management role, the compliance administrator role, or the eDiscovery manager role? So on this one, for question 5, which role can you not see unless you have been given permissions to view the alerts from that alert category?
And also, if you think about that think about ABAC. And there are very specific permissions for each category. And there is on docs.microsoft.com, you can also find what kind of permissions you have in the Purview portal for the specific roles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we currently have already some votes here. So the
Yes, we
right
do.
answer is, in that case, the eDiscovery Manager role group.
Yep. And we talked about kind of that explicit permissions, right, in that case.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you want to do another one?
Yeah, let's do one more and then
We wrap up the session.
we'll wrap it up, yeah.
Yeah, so next one would be question number 7.
Question number 7. All right, so when the general guide, what's the general guideline as to when an organization should use scoped directory searches? Is it A, when an organization selects groups and sites as the scope for its sensitivity labels? Or is it B, when the organization uses eDiscovery Premium? Or is it C, when an organization has multiple companies within its tenant and wants to keep them separate? So what are the instances in which we would want to use the idea of scoped directory searches? We definitely talked about that one.
Yeah, we definitely talked about that one. It's the first step before you can do that thing.
Correct. Yep, absolutely. All right. So give it another second for people to get their votes in. I think we have some votes. There we do. All right. So what's the answer? Multiple companies. Yep.
Yeah.
C. Yeah. So this is where we talked about information barriers, right? That if I wanted to set up an information barrier, and we talked about it in both the sense of a compliance, like financial regulation, right? That might be the same company, or, right, I gave the example of acquisitions, right? If you have multiple companies, you might want to prevent them from being able to talk to each other. So great questions, and thanks for everyone.
That being said, I hope you enjoyed today's Learn Live session and you went with us through the whole module. I think you will be able to answer all the questions. We just did 3 of them. But to give you a quick summary, what we did today, we talked about data classification with sensitivity labels within Microsoft Teams. Then we talked a lot about retention and deletion. Also think about how we can use data loss prevention to protect our data from data leakage. Other things we talked about is communication compliance and use cases around communication compliance and why we should do that. And then we talked about how we can prevent users from talk to each other with information barrier policies. We managed eDiscovery cases and searched for content within our Microsoft directory. And also we looked into compliance recording policies. Also, think about how you can configure your alert policies. So I hope you enjoyed today's module and hope to see you soon. Go through the Learn Live experience. Join us, learn with us, look at the videos, look at our talks. We give you some tips out of a practical experience, what we learn with our customers every single day. And also think about using other Learn Live modules. So the next one would be Introduction to Microsoft Sentinel. And it's a series of 7 episodes. And don't miss the Sentinel configuration and also create and manage Microsoft Sentinel workspaces. If you are looking into Sentinel configuration, this is a great way to start with that.
Absolutely. Perfect. Well, I think that's everything. Thank you, Martina. That was fantastic. And I hope everyone had some great information and learned a few things along the way. And I hope that everyone has an opportunity to click on the live learn. And if you have questions, both Martina and I's Twitter handle is there, so feel free to reach out to us via Twitter. We're more than happy to be able to answer questions and just continue the discussion. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, morning, night, whatever it happens to be. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.